Hello, and welcome back to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast. Nina Dudnik, founder and CEO of Seeding Labs, based in Boston, Massachusetts, will be sharing with us today about some of the challenges she faced as she transitioned from scientist to nonprofit leader. But before we jump into that, are you struggling with getting your team on the same page? Are you facing miscommunication, gossip, or worse, apathy? After being labeled the nonprofit therapist by some of my clients, I've started sharing some of the tools I use that have earned me that reputation, one of which is communication styles and the DISC assessment. To learn more, visit nonprofitleaders.com/DISC, D-I-S-C.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast, where your host, KIRSTEN Bullock, interviews nonprofit CEOs and executive directors who share what's working. Show notes can be found at nonprofitleadersnetwork.com. Please add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. Now, let's get on with the show.
Thank you, Nina, so much for joining me today and being open to share a little bit of your story with us.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Nina Dudnik is the founder and CEO of Seeding Labs. Nina decided at a very early age to become a scientist, but her interest in science always had a humanitarian angle. Nina has a PhD in molecular biology from Harvard University and has worked for the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research in Italy and was also a Fulbright Scholar. Nina's been named a TED Global Fellow and one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology by Scientific American's Worldview magazine. She was recognized with the New England Biolab's 2016 Passion in Science Humanitarian Duty Award and the 2014 John F. Kennedy New Frontier Award. Seeding Labs was among Fast Company magazine's top 10 most innovative not-for-profit companies in 2015 and has been featured in the Boston Globe and the Wall Street Journal. So it sounds like you've been really busy since the founding of Seeding Labs.
Yes, there's not been a lot of downtime.
So could you share with us a little in your own words about Seeding Labs and how things are going right now?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The vision behind Seeding Labs is of an entire generation of scientific problem solvers working at the cutting edge in every single country in the world to tackle problems of great importance, either to their own communities or to the world at large. I'm a scientist by training, and so of course I happen to be a very big proponent of the use of science to solve problems that face us today. And I think there's a lot of obvious examples that have been in the news, right? Most recently Zika virus, and then 2 years ago Ebola virus, climate change effects on agriculture and being able to feed people, and new sources of energy, and all of these various problems that have as underpinnings scientific research that needs to be done to address them, develop new solutions. And historically, there's been a real imbalance and an inequity in who's actually part of that scientific endeavor. And scientists, there are millions of scientists across the developing world. A lot of them have the best training they could get from the best universities in the world, and they're trying to work in their home communities. And they face a lot of different obstacles in doing that. So Seeding Lab's goal is to ensure that that generation of scientists right now is working at maximum capacity, have the tools that they need, and in particular are connected with each other and with scientists everywhere in the world so that we can all work together. One of the crucial tools that seems to be one of the biggest barriers we find for scientists in the developing world is actually just the physical equipment to do science with. Lab equipment is very expensive and a hard to access good in the world. And so what Seeding Lab's core program is called Instrumental Access, and it's about making sure that scientists in the developing world have access to laboratory equipment. Not that they can send their samples to somebody in another lab in the U.S. or Europe and have them, out of the goodness of their heart, analyze those samples, but that they have that equipment in their labs in their home countries. And so we do that by partnering with scientific instrument manufacturers and R&D companies and universities here in the U.S. to transform this great surplus of lab equipment and make that affordable and available to scientists all over the world. So we have shipped full 20-foot containers of laboratory equipment, over $4 million worth of equipment now to scientists in 26 countries in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean and in Asia. And there's tens of thousands of scientists and their students in particular who are using that equipment right this very minute in training undergrads, doing master's and PhD theses, and doing research in all of these different important areas. And on top of that, our goal is, like I said, is to connect those scientists with each other and with scientists here who help to contribute to making them able to do that work. And so I can envision kind of in the future Seeding Labs having programs that do a lot more in terms of exchange programs and connectivity and collaboration among scientists all over the globe.
Mm-hmm. So you're doing great things, and there's more great things to come.
That is the plan.
Now, you're a scientist, so how did you get the idea to start Seeding Labs? You shared a little about the vision, but where was that initially birthed?
Well, for me personally, I was really interested in agricultural genetics. So I got very interested in the idea of using modern molecular genetics in agriculture in terms of, developing crops that could feed people better and more efficiently and grow in harsh climates and things like that. So I actually ended up working in agriculture internationally for a couple of years, and in particular, I spent a year in the Ivory Coast in West Africa in a research lab there. And it was the real culture shock of transitioning back to the U.S. to, incredibly advanced, beautiful, wonderful labs at Harvard Medical School from this lab in West Africa, and seeing the disparity in infrastructure in particular was so stark. And that made me even more passionate about the access to the tools of science for people everywhere, because I'd had wonderful colleagues who had terrific, advanced training and were working on really important problems. And so it was actually a sort of a volunteer effort that started with fellow graduate students in the basement of Harvard while we were still students by day and volunteers by nights and weekends to tap into the surplus of resources around us. So you think about now, every one of us has probably multiple cell phones or even computers that every time you replace one, what do you do with the old one? And the irony that we found was that this happens in every sector with every kind of instrument, including in science. And so there's, terrific cutting edge labs that have slightly outdated, or even not even outdated, but just they've already replaced and upgraded. And we thought this was an incredible resource to turn into, to power science all over the world. So Seeding Lab started as this all volunteer nights and weekends labor of love. And then I sort of was pointed to a couple of resources to turn it into an actual independent functioning organization.
Wow. So your first partners in that were your classmates?
Yes.
So in the next stage of that, did you identify people to come alongside you to help with that, or how did that next phase evolve?
It was an interesting transition. So the first inclination as a scientist, the idea of entrepreneurship was it was really not part of my education. I think that's changed in the last few years, that now it weaves throughout everybody's education, but it was never something that I was exposed to being trained as a scientist, as an undergrad or grad student. And so I've been running this volunteer effort for years, and then it had not really ever occurred to me explicitly that it could become an actual corporation. And so it was friends who were in business school and sort of this culture of entrepreneurship that's floating around universities in Boston in general. And somebody suggested to me to enter one of these university business plan contests. And that was an absolute sort of light switching on for me. It had really genuinely not occurred to me before that. It sounds crazy in retrospect to even say that. But so that business plan contest where they taught us all of these, how to read and write a business plan and how to pitch and all of these kinds of things was my first sort of burst of education in how to make this transition happen. And the first, it made me incredibly enthusiastic to actually make this happen. So that when I finished my PhD, I applied and quite a little bit of funding to actually make that transition happen. And the first people who came along, I was the only full-time actual employee of Seeding Labs for quite a while. But a lot of the folks who'd been involved as volunteers came along as the first board of directors. And that was actually fantastic. So for the first probably year and a half of Seeding Labs, it still felt like this incredible collective effort where, these folks were everybody on that first board were really invested because they'd personally been invested from the get-go. And so we did a lot of the very basic infrastructure building of an organization together in that first sort of year and a half, even though it was just me on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. But you had that team of people around.
Yeah.
And I've seen that happen, I wouldn't say infrequently, and I wouldn't say frequently, but just somewhere in there, that the initial push of founding an organization, there's a lot of people who are really excited, but then enthusiasm seems to wane, and then it's like the second wind that hits after a few years and growth happens. Did you experience that lull in interest?
No, I think, we had, like I said, everybody who was originally involved were actually, I think almost all of them were scientists. And a lot of them were still actually students. And so it was more of an issue of recognizing that there were some things that were kind of out of their background and expertise, and a lot of aspects that really just required more of a professional staff, that it couldn't just be a volunteer effort. And I was thinking, I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but the first business plan that we wrote, I think, assumed that it would remain entirely driven by volunteers. And it did not actually take a long time for the infeasibility of that to become obvious, that it really needed a professionalization of a real staff to drive it. And also that by professionalizing, one of the things that was really clear to me very quickly was that there were, aspects of what we do. Like I said, we have a massive logistics operation. We run an international supply chain, and there are lots and lots of businesses of every type that do that already. That we were trying to kind of reinvent the wheel in a lot of sectors that we didn't have to, and by hiring people from those kinds of backgrounds to be professional full-time staff, that was going to make us able to do the kind of work we wanted to do at the scale we wanted to do, far more than what we had originally envisioned. And so literally the first person that Seeding Labs hired after me came from a warehousing and logistics and shipping background, because it was quite clear to me that we were reinventing the wheel.
Right, and absolutely didn't need to.
Yeah.
So you say that your vision has evolved since you started from one of a volunteer organization to more professionalized, more developed. What do you see in the next 5 years?
In the next 5 years, I sort of alluded to this already. The foundation of Seeding Labs has very much been about the laboratory equipment and that basic physical infrastructure to do science. So to me, the next stage of Seeding Labs, that's the foundation. You cannot, have the best trained people in the world, if they don't have the tools, they are hamstrung. So now that we've really figured out a lot of the processes around helping people to get that infrastructure, the next stage is what happens, what do you build on top of that? What does that enable people to do, and how can Seeding Labs facilitate that? So some of that is building connections between scientists to foster those kinds of collaborations. One of the things that I find is we've developed a huge infrastructure to identify great scientists around the world. We have a very in-depth kind of an application and vetting process that we are unearthing people who are phenomenally well-trained, very smart, working on important problems, who get a lot less exposure. Their work is a lot less well-known in the scientific community. And so how do we help them make that next leap to find collaborators, to get funding? And then I think that the next stage after that is, how do we help them take their discoveries out of the lab? So I'm sitting here in Boston, where scientific entrepreneurship is one of the hottest topics in town, and there's lots and lots of research coming out of all kinds of institutions here that gets commercialized and makes it to market and has an impact on people's lives. How do we help scientists in, say, Ghana or Jamaica or Vietnam make that same transition with their discoveries? Because they're working on things that really could help people's lives in a significant way, but not if they're trapped in the lab.
Right. And if they've gotten training in science, but not in entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
Yeah. Does that hit home a little?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, it does. It's a very big leap from science to entrepreneurship mostly in how you think about what you're doing. Right? You're trained as a scientist to narrow things down to really elemental, solvable problems, and sometimes that can take years or even decades of work to solve those problems. Turning something into an actual functioning business involves it's a very different kind of approach to why and how you're doing things on a day-to-day basis, and certainly a difference in the level of data that you have at your disposal to feel comfortable to make the next decision. Sometimes you just have to go on gut instinct in running a business, and that's really different from the sort of burden of proof that you have to have before you make big steps in science.
That is a big difference. And where did your funding come from when you were just starting out and through this transition, and has the source of your funding evolved over time?
Our funding history has been very variable, I guess. The initial funds to start Seeding Labs came from an Echoing Green fellowship that I got in 2008. So that was really just the absolute basic to start the organization. We've had a fair amount of corporate funding over the years. We partner with a lot of private sector companies in the science world. And then our biggest transition over the last 2 years has come through support from USAID. And that's been transformational. That really allowed us to, I think, triple in staff size or more and build, sort of take what we had in terms of processes and infrastructure and get it to sort of a next level of scale. And that was huge.
Oh, I bet. And with that kind of funding, was there a lot more reporting and a lot more tracking required?
There was a lot more reporting, for sure. Although I haven't, to a large extent, I have not found that to be too burdensome. I would say that Seeding Labs is run by, and a large portion of the staff are still scientists, and we love data. So I know that I read a lot of. I'm a relative sort of newcomer still in the nonprofit sector, and I know that this issue of data and tracking and reporting is a real hot topic, and it's always a little bit amusing to me because it's just so second nature to me to collect data on everything that we do. That's how I was trained. It would almost be unthinkable to me not to do it. So it's, I would say from that standpoint, that's actually really just been baked into Seeding Labs from day one.
Good. And how has your leadership style changed over the years? You started as an all-volunteer organization, so I'm sure there was a lot of, there's camaraderie in that because you all started it together. How did your leadership style have to develop and change as you brought in more professionals?
I hesitate to answer that question because I have no idea how everybody else at Seeding Labs would answer that for me. Again, I suspect that, at least I hope that my style is still very non-hierarchical. In large part, I think, again, being trained as a scientist, it's not, setting up a very rigid hierarchy is antithetical to how I was trained myself. And Seeding Labs, in a lot of ways, the way that we still sort of argue about the best way to do things and continuously try to improve things based on immediate data and how did it work this time? How can we make it better next time? really requires a lot of equality amongst everybody on the staff in terms of everybody has input. Everybody needs to have input or we don't improve as a whole. So that to me has always stayed very, very important in seeding labs.
Right.
Things, all of the sort of HR trappings of an organization that you have to have, it was a very interesting experience, especially coming again out of academic science, where a lot of this is not really formalized, to build all of those kind of HR functions and processes. It was, again, it's, sort of been like getting an MBA in 10,000 tiny little steps.
Nice. Now, as you've grown and the organization has gotten bigger, I would imagine that there might be a few cases where something happened and you look back and think, oh my goodness, how did I let that happen? Would you be willing to share one of those learning experiences with us?
A lot of the things that have been hard have been actually around hiring. It turns out, and I don't think this is unusual I think this seems to be just the universal case, which is that it's a hard thing to do, to meet a stranger and decide that this, person with very few interactions is somebody you want to work with day in, day out. And, and I think with entrepreneurs in particular, the organization or the company that you build is your baby to a certain extent. And how, sharing your baby with others can be difficult. So I think there have been a number of cases where I would say that my analytical brain, I allowed it to take precedence over sort of gut instinct. And I certainly think that has been true in terms of making some hiring decisions or board decisions and things like that. And that has been a real lesson to me, to listen to your gut instinct. And not to overanalyze. Like I said, right, scientists are trained to make all your decisions on the basis of data. And actually that's, on the day-to-day basis of running a company, that doesn't actually always turn out to be best. And I think that's a very difficult lesson.
Right, the human side of things versus the science and analytical side of things.
Yeah.
I just want to say thanks so much for joining me today. Do you have any closing words to provide some inspiration or encouragement for other leaders who are listening in right now?
Well, I think this seems like the emerging theme of what I've been talking about is this very sort of 180 career transition that I made. And I really do think that smart people with great training in any background can make an enormous difference in the nonprofit sector. A lot of us are not seen as sort of the obvious candidates to work in nonprofit work and in social impact work. But there are many different kinds of backgrounds. Even someone who's a molecular biologist like me has real hard skills, in addition to your sort of emotional inclination to do this work, which I highly encourage people to consider it. It's not an impossible transition by any means. Sometimes it's really, as I like to say, it's just vocabulary and math. And all of that is learnable. So I would say that I'm definitely living proof that you can come from a background that is not immediately obvious to find a way into the nonprofit sector and do great work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nina.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And thank you to all our listeners for everything you do to make the world a better place.
Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast with Kirsten Bullock. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll check out our prior episodes and that you'll pass along our web address, nonprofitleadersnetwork.com, to your friends and colleagues in the nonprofit sector.